Thank you so much, Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you all for being here. And I would like to thank En'icas for their wonderful and amazing series in this summer school, which really has so many different and very interesting topics. And today, we actually have Professor John Reeves from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. He is the Blumenthal Professor of Judaic Studies and Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And he will be talking to us about what kind of Bible does the Qur'an presume familiarity. So let me tell you a little bit about Professor John Reeves. He's an amazing scholar who writes a lot about many of the different traditions that existed in the Near East, especially during late antiquity. And therefore, he basically...
دوستان صدای من رو به عنوان مترجم همزمان دارید؟
Sorry.
Sorry for interrupting.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so Professor Reeves works on many of the traditions that existed in the Near East, therefore situating his type of scholarship very much in the context of the emergence of the Quran during 7th century. And therefore, we all look forward to his talk about what kind of Bible does the Quran presume familiarity with. So, Professor Reeves, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. I want to thank the organizers and the host for honoring me with an invitation to address the students of this 4th summer school. And I hope that I can contribute some things for you to think about and prove worthy of your expectations. As my title expresses, I'm interested in the kind of scriptures that the Quran seems to presume familiarity with on the part of its audience. And so I'm going to start with some initial observations that I made a few years ago in print in an online journal called Mizan that sort of encapsulates what I think is the major issues that need to be addressed in this kind of inquiry that we're engaged in, at least for the next hour or so. Scholars have often used the appearance of Islam in the Mediterranean world of the 7th century as a marker of rupture, signaling the violent demise of the classical societies of antiquity and the onset of what frequently in the West has been termed the Dark Ages, an era when learning and so-called civilized life were supposedly supplanted by barbarism and fanaticism. Now, that's the kind of approach that I want to eschew. In contrast to that kind of approach, when I teach about these subjects to my students, I encourage them to study the emergence of Islam in the Near East in terms of its manifold ideational continuities with the monotheistic currents that were flowing through the Roman and the Iranian and the Aksumite and the South Arabian religious communities in the 6th and the 7th centuries. Early Islamic discourse and practice, I think, exemplify that there's this kind of a cross-cultural hegemony of a distinctive scriptural koine, what you might want to call an Abrahamic idiom of cultural expression. And by this, I mean that these communities are articulating their own cultural identity in terms of either an ethnic or a religious association with the characters and the locales and the practices and the ideas that are found in and promoted by various forms of Bible that were circulating within and beyond the Roman Empire during roughly the first half of the first millennium Common Era. There are very few scholars today who would deny that Bible has some kind of relevance for unpacking the emergence of Islam and the formulation of its scriptural heritage. But there are some things about this assumed and posited textual relationship between Bible and Quran that are commonly misunderstood, and I think that need to be further amplified. First, there exists, at least it seems to me, considerable critical naivete about the historical and cultural processes surrounding the formation of Near Eastern scriptural texts and canons. Many scholars operate with the assumption that the Bible was a fixed, closed collection of canonical texts within Judaism and Christianity well before the 7th century. A set of writings which was universally recognized and that was virtually identical with those found in the Bible of today. There's a problem here, however. There's no such thing as the Bible. And by that I mean singular number and the use of the definite article the. There's no such thing as the Bible. Instead, what we have is a variety of Bibles, plural, which vary enormously in terms of their contents, their editorial structures, and their regional distributions up to and well beyond the 7th century. For example, the so-called Masoretic Hebrew text of the Bible, which forms the basis for modern Western translations of Hebrew Bible, did not exist as such in the prophet's day. Therefore, to affirm, as many do, that Quran presupposes the Bible begs the question of my presentation's title. Which Bible? Whose Bible? Ethiopian Christians, one of the religious communities that are closest in time and space to the early Muslim Ummah, use a biblical canon which looks very different from the ones that are constructed by Christian and Jewish communities in Egypt, Asia Minor, Syria, Mesopotamia, or Central Asia. One must also bear in mind that we have biblically affiliated groups like the Elkosites or the Marcionites or the Manichaeans who identify themselves as Christian. And so their textual proclivities have to be taken into account in these kinds of reconstructions, especially because we have some historical notices that place groups like these three in the Transjordan and in Arabia. We have to ask questions like, what kind or kinds of Bible were used by Jews living in Yemen, or by the Christian communities living in South Arabia, or by the Zindiq members of the tribe of Quraysh who dwelt at Mecca? Should the boundaries of what the label Bible embraces be expanded to include something like the Cave of Treasures, a pre-Islamic Christian work which effectively replaces Bible in much of the Eastern Universal Chronicle tradition of historiography? Most studies of Quran or of early Islam don't address these kinds of fundamental issues at all. Yet recognizing them is absolutely crucial, I think, for achieving a deeper insight into the kind of contextualized discourse that the Quran allegedly is presupposing. Certain fundamental conceptual and methodological problems have to be addressed and resolved also. For example, just waving around terms, reified generic categories like Jews or Christians or the Syriac Church do not adequately address the complexity of religious identity in the Eastern Roman and Sasanian worlds of late antiquity. None of these labels displays a critical understanding of the various regional and cultural differences that differentiated these and other biblically allied groupings. There was, for example, no such thing as the Syriac Church, to which one can attribute a governing structure, a fixed canon, or a doctrinal uniformity. Similarly, we witness a variety of Jewish behaviors and institutional hierarchies across the Eastern world of late antiquity. pronouncements and conclusions about the backgrounding of Quranic language and characters and the literatures of Jews or Christians require considerably more cultural nuancing than has typically been the case to date. We must also avoid working with the indefensible proposition that any Jewish or Christian exegetical tradition or testimony must necessarily be older than any similarly formed Muslim one, and thus may be presupposed as the intertextual background for traditions in Quran or its interpretative literature. This is an uncritical, I would even call it a pre-modern approach to the study of Jewish and Christian literary traditions. It's driven largely by apologetic and theological concerns. We have to always remember, I think, that these distinct religious communities of Jews, of Christians, of Muslims were not hermetically sealed packages. They read, they discussed, they disputed, they adapted, they rejected, and they parodied each other's literary materials, as is abundantly illustrated in the historical and the theological literatures that they respectively generate. Care must be exercised by comparative philologists when they're using Jewish exegetical collections and anthologies that actually come out of an Islamic cultural sphere. I'm thinking here of midrashic writings like Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer or the Midrash Haggadah. If a particular shared motif or theme is not present in what are indubitably pre-Islamic Jewish sources, our first instinct may be to identify it as having been borrowed or adapted from Islam. And there are indeed a number of instances where this seems to be the case. But at the same time, we also have to bear in mind that these same post-Quranic works may have been privy to genuinely older Jewish textual constellations that were extant within their communities that can go back as far as the Second Temple period of Jewish history. By the same token, those circles who generate Quran and its associated literatures may have very well had knowledge of or access to early forms of Bible, which were literarily speaking earlier in form and content than what surfaces as a canonical text later on. So the question will be, how do we adjudicate the tension between these two hermeneutic positions? It's a complex process, and I'll tell you, it admits of no easy resolution. Now, simply, cursorily perusing the Quran is enough to confirm that its contents intersect with a biblical world of discourse. We all recognize this. Prominent characters who figure within the stories found in most versions of both Jewish and Christian Bibles, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, also are featured in the Quran, as are a number of the tale cycles that are associated with each of them. It doesn't seem too far a stretch to conclude that Bible and Quran share a common substrate of ancestral and epic traditions whose roots will stretch back to Second Temple Palestine, and that moreover, the particular packaging of these shared traditions in their Quranic form didn't materialize out of thin air, but instead it relies upon the transmission efforts of generations of Jewish, Christian, and religiously allied traditions, both learned and lay, who were engaged in the recounting, the reformulating, and the promulgating of biblical lore in both oral and written registers to their religious communities in the Near East during the first millennium of the Common Era. As I mentioned earlier, we need to remember that modern uncritical assumptions about something like the Bible as a universally distributed canon of scriptures whose contents and wording were fixed by the end of the first or the second centuries of the Common Era will not survive a critical scrutiny. Nor should any credence be given to the popular but wrong-headed notion that demonstrably late versions of Bible, such as its medieval Masoretic edition, should always be chronologically privileged over temporally prior so-called interpretations or alleged derivatives. The Christian communities who were in the closest geographical proximity to 7th century Arabia, the several Syriac language churches which flourished in Syria, Mesopotamia, the Sasanian East, and the Persian Gulf, and the Ethiopic language church of the Aksumite kingdom across the Red Sea, they possessed and they distributed collections of scriptures whose contents embraced, when viewed from our later perspective, both canonical and non-canonical works. Jewish communities who had migrated to the Arabian Peninsula over the past 1,000 years, or who flourished in neighboring locales like Egypt or Syria or Babylonia, exhibit a knowledge of traditional tales and lore that goes well beyond the boundaries of what will eventually become the biblical canon. We must also not forget the possible role that other religious movements like Manichaeism and Mandeism may have played in the wider dissemination of Bible and its affiliated traditions, given that both of those religions' affections for teachings and writings that allegedly stemmed from pre-flood biblical ancestors like Adam or Seth or Enosh or Enoch. If, as one recent scholar has phrased it, the Quran has a, quote, biblical subtext, end quote, comes from Professor Reynolds, the search for that subtext should not be restricted to the 24 books of the Jewish Bible or the 66 books of the Protestant Christian Bible, or even the more expansive rosters of biblical works found among the Roman Catholic or the various linguistically diverse Orthodox expressions of Christianity. It necessarily will extend across a broad swath of religious literature that's often classified as apocryphal, expositional, or amplificatory. Now, if there's any doubt that remains with regard to this basic operating principle, it should be noticed that Qur'an itself appears to bear witness to both the physical existence and the divine authority of what we would term pseudepigraphical writings. For example, the 87th Surah, verses 18 through 19, appeals to the earliest scriptures, the scriptures of Abraham and Moses. And there's a quotation that's provided for you in the slide that I sent a little bit earlier. And I apologize for, I only noticed right before we started that the slide had mangled the Arabic text. So if I have the ability to share screen, I can show you a better picture. But here this would be quotation 1A of that particular handout. The earlier scriptures, the scriptures of Abraham and Moses, it appeals to them as providing support for its pronouncements about the eternal bliss that await the pious and the everlasting fiery punishment that await the wicked in the world to come. All this, Quran says, is in them. Now, while it's certainly possible that an otherwise unqualified reference to a set of earlier scriptures attributed to Moses is just another way of signifying the familiar 5 books of Moses, or the Mosaic Torah, or the Pentateuch, it should be recalled that the Quran often refers to that latter collection by its proper name, that is, the Torah, a designation which appears to be etymologically associated with Hebrew Torah, and which arguably serves as a blanket term for the entire corpus of Jewish revelatory lore, the same way that the label Injil is used to demarcate the broad spectrum of Christian scriptures, and is not just limited to gospel literature. Nevertheless, the Quran also names what is unmistakably the Mosaic Torah. As an example, the book, the Kitab, which we gave to Moses, or sometimes refers to simply the book of Moses, the Kitab Musa. showing that it can use different locutions to express that same reference. Yet this passage's unusual bracketing of Mosaic writings in the plural, earlier scriptures of Abraham and Moses, with another set of writings that are attributed to the patriarch Abraham, suggests that maybe a different group of books might be intended by this unusual phraseology. Is the Quran speaking in these two passages in Surah 87? You also have a reference to it in Surah 53. Is it speaking about apocryphal works, parascriptural works, like the Book of Jubilees, or the Qumran Temple Scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, or the Testament of Moses, or in the case of the scriptures of Abraham, works like the Testament of Abraham or the Apocalypse of Abraham, which is only to mention the most obvious examples of this apocryphal scriptural lore that surrounds the text of Bible? Does Quran share with the Book of Jubilees the idea that Moses received on Sinai a more expansive collection of revelatory lore than what is typically connoted by the phrase written Torah in classical Jewish sources? Does it, like Jubilees, presume that Abraham was a student, a copyist, and a conduit for ancient Hebrew writings that were allegedly produced by his ancestors? The larger context wherein these Quranic appeals to scriptures of Abraham and Moses, those larger contexts are particularly suggestive for a possible correlation with passages from Jewish apocryphal sources. Immediately prior to its scriptural invocation in Surah 87, verses 16 through 17, we get a statement that says in English, "Yet you prefer the life of this world, whereas that of the world to come is better and long-lasting." Now, in this connection, the French scholar Geneviève Jobillot has recently called attention to one theme that connects several of the apocryphal characterizations of the careers of Abraham and Moses. Namely, they both share a reluctance to depart from mortal life on the day when the angel of death comes to collect them. Their ultimately unsuccessful attempts, however, to elude the angel of death form the structural scaffolding, we could say, for works like the Testament of Abraham and a group of medieval Jewish midrashim that are called the Patirat Moshe, or the removal of Moses cycles of tales, the latter of which have some pre-Islamic precursors in works like the Testament of Moses and in the Book of Biblical Antiquities attributed to a man named Pseudo-Philo from the 1st century of the Common Era. Similarly, in the 53rd surah of the Quran, we have stressed the message that every individual bears sole responsibility for the kind of reward and punishment that they might expect in the hereafter. And that's a message that's consonant with the one conveyed by Abraham's vision of the heavenly judgments meted out to both saints and sinners in the Testament of Abraham. Now, those correspondences that Jobillot points out are certainly intriguing, and they're worthy of careful consideration. But one's left wondering whether this is enough to pronounce positively that passages like that are dependent specifically upon the Testament of Abraham. We have, after all, an abundance of sermonic and exhortatory literature within both Jewish and Christian traditions that warn individuals about how they conduct their daily lives, and which promise an afterlife reward or punishment that's keyed to certain behavioral patterns that we practice in the here and now, much of which has no exclusive connection with the names of either Abraham or Moses. More pointedly, one must also ask whether the recoverable textual history of an apocryphal work like the Testament of Abraham viably lends itself to exploitation by scribes or purveyors of biblically affiliated lore in the Arabian Peninsula slightly before or during the 7th century. Despite many scholars' eagerness to assign a very early date to the composition and promulgation of this Testament of Abraham, in fact, almost all of the textual evidence for its physical existence in any form postdates the advent of Islam. Prior to the 7th century, we have very little data which would indicate that the Testament of Abraham even existed. Roughly contemporaneous canon lists that we find in the Western Church mention a book named Abraham in Greek, Abraham. This might be the same one as our Testament, but there's other works that we find mentioned in lists like this also attributed to Abraham. Other Abrahamic pseudepigrapha, like that Apocalypse of Abraham that I mentioned earlier, and that has to be considered a candidate for the identity of that particular work. There's an Eastern ecclesiastical compilation that's known as the Apostolic Constitutions, and it professes knowledge of apocryphal books associated with the 3 patriarchs. And by that, you usually mean the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they tend to be bundled together in some linguistic traditions. But it still doesn't specify what these works might be. No church fathers explicitly quote from the Testament of Abraham, although there's some tantalizing allusions to revelatory or prophetic writings possibly tied to Abraham by the church father Origen, Priscillian, and Jerome. While Epiphanius claims that the so-called Sethian sect forged an apocalypse under the name of Abraham that was, quote, filled with every kind of wickedness, end quote, as well as other books which they claim stemmed from Moses. And then we have the late 8th century Church of the East scholastic, Theodore Barconi, even quoting 3 passages from a so-called Apocalypse of Abraham, not one of which, however, overlaps in any way with the contents of the Apocalypse of Abraham that we find today in most modern collections of Jewish pseudepigrapha. So to sum up, there's almost no concrete textual evidence that we can use to bolster the aforementioned claim that Qur'an is referencing here in its scriptures of Abraham, the Testament of Abraham, or the Apocalypse of Abraham, a situation which casts a cloud of uncertainty on the veracity of the connection that's being argued. One's even tempted to point to that same disturbingly vague conjunction of written works supposedly emanating from Abraham and Moses, which appears in Epiphanius in the 4th century in connection with his Sethians, as critical evidence for this particular pairing's rhetorical as opposed to historical or material utility. Well, this is not promising. Our initial inability to confirm with any confidence that the scriptures of Abraham and Moses encode a reference to, say, apocryphal sources that we know about. It doesn't mean, though, that we need to abandon attempts to contextualize Qur'an in this way. As we emphasized above, the literary network within which Qur'an and its early interpreters are working was one that's suffused with biblical and biblically allied discourses of variegated sorts, both canonical and non-canonical from our later perspective. And so it's quite probable that apocryphal Jewish and Christian sources undergird certain Quranic passages in much the same way that apocryphal Christian sources demonstrably do, as in the stories about Jesus, and which come from some of the New Testament apocryphal works. We do, however, need to think about and approach the interpretation of likely characters, or scenes, or motifs, or themes, even verbiage, in a more carefully nuanced and targeted manner than has usually heretofore been the case. This means that arguments that are going to posit a connection between a Quranic locution or depiction and a Jewish or Christian scriptural source should exercise precision and go well beyond just vague generic affinities, which, when all is said and done, actually really add nothing concrete to our understanding about the intellectual background of the text of the Quran. By contrast, observable intertextual sharing of singular or unusual verbal or narrative features can often signal a likely point of intersection between Quran and its interpreters and these non-canonical Jewish and Christian writings. If such nodal points can be identified, conscientious scholars must then scrutinize the transmission history of the relevant writing or writings and assess the probability of its availability in a linguistically meaningful written or oral venue in the Arabian Peninsula and its immediate environs during the 6th, the 7th, and even the 8th centuries. Now, returning to our earlier example of the Testament of Abraham, it seems on the face of it improbable that a written version of this text would have preceded the 7th century, given that the oldest manuscripts of its editions, Greek recensions, which is the likely language of composition and the presumable basis for later translations, none of them predate the 11th century. But there are certain distinctive themes or narratological tropes which occur in its written versions that could very well already have been extant in a detached form as figurative object lessons, or schoolroom exercises, or oral glosses, or homiletic expositions, which as a rule leave a much fainter impression in the written record, since they tend to be produced in the oral register. For example, excuse me, a very early Shi'i tradition commenting on the relationship of Muhammad and Ali to their earlier prophetic forebears points out that once when this pair was walking about in Medina, trees began to talk to them verbally and compare them to illustrious figures of the past like Moses and Aaron, Noah, and Abraham. Now, the striking appearance here of talking trees is reminiscent of the portentous scene that occurs in the Testament of Abraham, where Abraham and a heavenly messenger also overhear a talking tree. Now, while this simple parallel and characterization is certainly not enough to cement a genetic connection between the two sources, there are, after all, other narratological occasions where trees can be overheard to burst out with pious acknowledgments, even sing in song. It does serve to caution us about making snap judgments without thinking carefully about the ramifications of all the available evidence, and to not underestimate the complexity of the verbal matrices which seem to link the various legends about the ancestors, the various scriptural traditions that lie behind the emergence of distinctive biblically affiliated communities like classical Judaism, Eastern forms of Christianity, and early Islam. The scriptures of Abraham and Moses is not the only Quranic expression which explicitly compares earlier writings with the new scripture. Another phrase which may be relevant for our larger purposes is the phrase, quote, tales about the ancients. And this is illustrated for you in quotation 1b from the slide. That seems to be a seemingly derogatory label that the opponents of the prophet use to dismiss the contemporary application of the prophet's teachings. Surah 20, verse 133, moreover, mentions earlier or even primal scriptures. And this is quotation 1c of the slide, whose essential veracity, it's argued, the revelation of the Quran confirms. There are also multiple places where the Quran asserts that whenever God in the past sent prophets to instruct or to warn humanity, he sent down scripture, kitab, with them. Surah 2, verse 213, Surah 3, verse 81, and so on. A number of places. Now, this coupling of past prophetic messengers with authenticating scriptural texts, which mutually reinforce one another and authorize one another, is a very suggestive move, which appears to signal knowledge about a larger corpus of books and revelatory writings that are associated with earlier scriptural heroes like Adam, or Enoch, or Noah, or Abraham. The Quran thus seems to endorse the idea that Jewish and Christian scriptures comprise a more extensive library of titles than is anachronistically projected onto 7th century Arabia by modern scholars. A textual illustration might help solidify this point. And here I'm going to be referring to the quotation 1b that appears on the handout from Surah number 2, verse 37. Toward the end of one of the Quran's renditions of the biblical Garden of Eden story or paradise story, you have the verse that cryptically states, quote, "Then Adam received words from his Lord, and he," that is his Lord, "forgave him. Lo, he is the forgiving one, the merciful one," end quote. Now, just what were these words which Adam supposedly received from God shortly after the time he and his wife were expelled from paradise? Traditional commentators tend to explain the passage by linking it to the slightly longer version of the same paradise story that we have recounted in Surah 7, verses 19 through 25, where Adam and his wife explicitly verbalize their sincere remorse for their transgression and talk about their utter reliance on the guidance of God. The words which Adam received, according to this interpretation, amount to divine instructions for how to go about repenting or repentance. Nevertheless, the sequential positioning of Adam's reception of words from God in Surah 2, verses 35 through 39, is particularly intriguing in light of the various legends that are found in a few Jewish, but especially in Eastern Christian sources, about one or more writings that were supposedly revealed to Adam and which were then entrusted by him at his death to his son Seth. This verbal legacy, or to use the title that is usually called in Christian circles, this testament of Adam, was an astonishingly popular text that's extant in several recensions and multiple languages, including Greek, Armenian, Georgian, Coptic, Syriac, Arabic, and Ethiopic. And it's often simply embedded within Arabic language versions of the extremely influential Cave of Treasures cycle of biblical legends that I toward the beginning of my presentation. Analogous legends that feature supererogatory rituals of penitence, an apocryphal prayer of Adam, and even a chart of angelic hierarchies keyed to the 12 months of the year also seem to have played a role in some Jewish tales about the post-garden lives of Adam and Eve, particularly in that cluster of stories that are associated with the revelation of a so-called holy book to Adam by the angel Raziel. And here I'm referring to a story that appears in translation on the slide of quotations in sections 2A and B. I want to go through those stories with you here briefly. The first one is the prayer of Adam that comes from an artificial book that its 19th century editor called the Book of Noah. It actually stems, though, from some earlier sources, where it gives the story that after Adam had engaged in entreaty of God, expressing remorse for his sin in the garden, for 30 days, the angel Raziel, who is the angel who's enthroned above the river that flows out of paradise, Gan Eden in Hebrew, or the Garden of Eden, came to him and revealed information to him until sundown, until the darkening of the sun. And in the angel's hand was a book. And he said to Adam, "Adam, Why are you alarmed? Why are you mournful and worried? Your words were heard from the day that you began to stand in prayer and supplication, or from the very first day of that 30-day period of remorse. I've come to instruct you using clear words and much wisdom, and to make you learned in the words of this sacred book, one that I'm holding in my hand. With them, you're going to gain knowledge about what's going to be happening to you up to the day of your death. And any one of your children who's going to arise in your stead, and all the latter generations who treat this book the way that you're supposed to do, with purity of flesh, humility of spirit, doing everything that's inscribed in it, are going to gain knowledge of what is coming during each and every month, whether day or night, and everything is going to be revealed to such a one. And then you get a whole list of kinds of things of both promising prosperity or woes that they will have foreknowledge of. Now you, Adam, approach more closely. I'll disclose to you the manner of this book and its sacral qualities. So the angel Raziel opened up the book and he read it out loud to Adam. And when Adam heard the words of that sacred book from the mouth of the angel Raziel, he collapsed on his face, quivering. Then the angel said, Adam, get up, be strong, don't be afraid, do not fear. Take the book from my hand, but be very careful with it, for you're going to gain knowledge and insight from it, and you will make it known to everyone who is worthy of it, and it will eventually become their inheritance, their share. And at the moment that Adam received the book, there was a fire that suddenly burst out on the bank of the river where the revelatory scene was taking place. And the angel ascended on that flame of fire back toward heaven. And as a result, Adam understood and realized that he had been discoursing, he'd been talking with an angel of God and not just some ordinary person. And that this book had been dispatched from the presence of the Holy King. So he took hold of it, took possession of it in sanctity and in purity. And this being then a response to the repentance that Adam feels and undergoes and practices as a result of being cast out of the garden, which it's important to note that in the biblical form of the story that you have, let's say in the Masoretic text of the Hebrew Bible, Adam and Eve in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, Adam never expresses remorse or repentance for what happened there. And stories like this are come to fill in that kind of gap. Also related to that is the next text that appears there, the Syriac Testament of Adam, where you get a kind of a glimpse of the kinds of foreknowledge that Adam was granted. So that here Adam receives information from on high, and he's communicating it to his son Seth. I've heard, my son, that God is going to come into the world after a long time. So you have a Christian prediction here of the coming of Jesus. He can be born by a virgin and wear a body, be born like a human being and mature and so on and so forth. For he said to me in paradise after I had plucked some of the fruit which concealed death within it, Adam, Adam, don't fear. You wanted to become a god. That was the reason that was given in the biblical story for why Adam and Eve eat from the forbidden fruit. You wanted to become a god, and I'm going to make you a god, just not now. After a period of many years, I have to deliver you over to death now, and the maggot and the worm are going to consume your body as a result of your hearkening to the words of the serpent. But after a brief time, right, I'm going to show mercy to you because you were created in my image, and I'm not going to leave you to waste away in Sheol, hell, Gehenna. For your sake, I shall be born from the Virgin Miriam, and for your sake, I shall experience death and enter the realm of death. For your sake, I will fashion new heavens, and I will put your descendants in positions of authority among them. After 3 days, I shall resuscitate the body which I wore on your account. Then I will set you at the right hand of my divine station, and I will make you a god like you wished. He also learns about the flood that's going to be coming. It's going to destroy the whole world on account of the sins of Cain. And then learns that the world has a lifespan to it, and amounts to 6,000 years, which is based on some early Christian chronography about how many years extend from creation to the end of the world. And then I, Seth, wrote down this testament and describes the funeral services that are given to his father and the kinds of entourage he had by angels and heavenly powers accompanying his body to the grave, and natural sorts of signs of mourning like the sun and the moon being eclipsed, thick darkness for 7 days. And then setting up the scenario for the Cave of Treasures cycle of tales, where inside that tomb of Adam are also going to be presented offerings that will eventually be brought to Jesus by the Magi. Finished is the testament of our ancestor Adam. So you have some materials there that are very interesting for trying to correlate with that Quranic passage. In almost every instance, Adam's remorse for his transgression is duly recognized by the deity or his angelic representative, and Adam receives a consolation prize. In the Jewish version of the legend, he gets a heavenly book, which outlines the course of future history, which has certain divinatory properties. In the Christian versions of the legend, he learns about the coming of the flood and the future advent of Jesus and the repercussions this event are going to have for his own and his descendants' fates. And therein, his son Seth, as we saw, dutifully records his words in writing, from which point it then becomes a part of Adam's legacy to the future generations of the human race. So it thus seems possible that Qur'an might be cognizant of this peculiar aspect of Adam's Zita, which is not biblical, but which certainly is playing a role in both those Jewish and Christian legendary cycles that kind of surround the Adam and Eve story like a shadow. And it's maybe subtly signaling via that verse 37 of Surah 2, its own endorsement of that kind of motif. Now, associating one or more books with Adam or early pious forefathers, this becomes an extremely common theme in post-Quranic commentaries and historiographical compilations and so-called Tales of the Prophets anthologies. And it's probably worth our while to briefly rehearse some of these traditions at this stage of our survey, because these take a number of forms over the course of the first few centuries of Islamic discussion. According to Ibn Hisham, the language that's used in passages like the verse 37 of Surah 2 or verse 122 of Surah 20 suggests that God indeed provided Adam with a book, a kitab, via the agency of the angel Jibril. Wahb ibn Munabi, an infamous early transmitter of biblical lore among Muslim scholars, tells us that Adam actually received 2 writings, one while he was still in paradise, the second after he was kicked out. Another prominent early transmitter or tradint, Abu Dar al-Ghifari, assigns 10 books to Adam. But perhaps one of the most popular, widely distributed traditions maintains that Adam received 21 divinely revealed scriptures, which is an astonishing sum of writings, right? But it may reflect at least some acquaintance with the truly massive quantity of alleged Adamic writings that circulated within Eastern Christian churches of the late first millennium of the Common Era. These and other traditions will also speak about a wide range of written scriptures to which the aforementioned Wahb supposedly had access, with some total numbers ranging from 73 to 90, 92, 93, or even 104 revealed scriptures, some of which were familiar to Jewish or Christian congregations, but others of which were relatively obscure. The differentiation between those scriptures which were public and those which were not, as well as the grand total of revelatory books, are very reminiscent of a similar story that features his Jewish predecessor Ezra where the latter's miraculous production of 94 divine scriptures is described for us in the apocryphal book that's known as 4 Ezra, chapter 14, verses 38 through 50. Now, knowledge of this apocryphal book of 4 Ezra, or at least traditions closely tied to it among Muslim bibliophiles, is hardly a problematic issue. Vivian Camero has elegantly demonstrated how 2 passages from this vast corpus of prophetic legends ascribed to Wahb are almost certainly based on 4 Ezra. And Adriana Drent has published an early Arabic manuscript of 4 Ezra, which seems to have been made from a Syriac text, form of Christian Aramaic used in the East, that's closely related to the one that's contained in the 6th or the 7th century Peshitta manuscript or Syriac Bible known as Codex Ambrosianus, our earliest complete Bible in Syriac. The text of 4 Ezra in this same Arabic manuscript is preceded by an Arabic version of the so-called Apocalypse of Baruch, or Second Baruch, one again which exhibits a close affinity with the sole surviving Syriac version that's also preserved in that aforementioned Codex Ambrosianus. But the 2 translations seem to come from different translators. Now, while the deposit of this manuscript inside a Christian monastery almost guarantees its Christian provenance, certain peculiarities of style that are found in these translations, such as a familiarity with Quranic language and orthography, as opposed to the language and orthography found in Bible, has led to some speculation about their possible Muslim origin. Moreover, a version of 4 Ezra 14, which is closely related to the one contained in the Mount Sinai manuscript, is also present in an unpublished chronicle that's indubitably of Muslim origin, a manuscript that's in Berlin, known as Springer 30. It's thus worth considering whether Islamic assumptions about the scribal loquacity of earlier prophets and teachers may have been fueled by a direct knowledge of the apocryphal legend about Ezra and his miraculous restoration of Israel's Torah. One might, for example, consider the case of Ka'b al-Akhbar, an enigmatic figure from the initial decades of Islam who enjoyed some interreligious notoriety among Jews, Christians, and Muslims as a purveyor of scriptural lore and legendary. In the autobiographical story of his conversion to Islam that was published from a manuscript in the British Library, Ka'b is represented as saying this: "Before I knew about Islam, I had read 88 bound volumes of the wisdom of the ancients without finding anything that had been erased or changed. Then I read the Torah, and I found 10 statements within it that had been erased, moved from their places, or changed. I asked the Jews about this, but I could find no one who could explain this to me. Then I compared the gospel, and I found that what had been erased from the Torah had also been erased from the gospel. I asked the Christians about this, and they said to me, there's only one person who can explicate this for you, a man from Mount Lucain who calls himself the monk Bulukia." Now, after consulting this learned monk, Ka'b learns that the altered passages from the Jewish Torah and the Christian gospel are present in their pristine form in the Qur'an, a circumstance which induces him to embrace the new scriptural revelation mediated through the prophet. But it's the very specificity of the 88 bound volumes of the wisdom of the ancients that gives one pause. Is it possible that these 88 earlier scriptures are an echo of the 94 books that were miraculously revealed to Ezra in 4 Ezra? If we add the 5 books of the Torah plus the gospel to these 88, that'll yield us the number 94. On the other hand, dividing Torah into 5 separate books doesn't happen very often in Muslim literature. Regardless of how we might explain this particular example, it certainly looks as if knowledge of the apocryphal Ezra legend was widespread in the early Islamic world. Yet the depth of this knowledge can prove deceptive. The single direct mention of Ezra that we have in the Quran is a case in point. In Surah 9, verse 30, famous passage that advances the claim, quote, "The Jews say Ezra is the son of God. The Christians say Christ is the son of God," end quote. And the verse advances the claim in order to criticize how these two religious groups have compromised their supposedly monotheistic roots. While the assertion that's placed in Christian mouths is one that's well attested in Christian literature, the parallel ascription of a divine sonship to Ezra is nowhere present in Jewish sources. It seems possible, as some have suggested, that Ezra's status as a son of God might be due to an assimilation that's taking place between Ezra and another biblical character, namely Enoch, that's been generated from the tradition about Ezra's alleged ascension to heaven that's narrated in the Syriac and Arabic renditions of the final verses of the 14th chapter of 4 Ezra. Combined with Enoch's post-biblical reputation as a human being who's been turned into an angel, hence son of God, and a divine scribe. Now, according to Hermann Gunkel, an early 20th century biblical scholar, the title that was given to Ezra in these Semitic language versions of 4 Ezra 14, eternal scribe of the knowledge of the Lord, actually seemed to fit Enoch better than Ezra. There's also another attractive interpretive option for resolving the problem of Q930, which involves accepting this old hypothesis of where Uzziah is actually a reference to a particular rogue angel, Uzziah, an indisputable son of God, who's one of the principal villains in the apocryphal book of Enoch. An erroneous conflation with another similarly named biblical character, like the Azariah of Daniel chapter 3. And that narrative situation of one whose appearance was like that of a son of God, together with Daniel's 3 fins in the fiery furnace, has also been suggested. But there's really no truly satisfactory solution to this particular Quranic conundrum, and solving it remains a desideratum. Ezra legends, however, are a double-edged sword in the kinds of contentious verbal battles amongst the scripturally based communities for textual supremacy. Already in the 9th century, the early Muslim historian Yaqubi has altered the grand narrative, furnishing the narratological skeleton for the biblical portion of his history, namely the Syriac Cave of Treasures, by replacing Ezra with a considerably more obscure biblical character, Zerubbabel, and erasing any hint that the latter's successful recovery of Israelite scriptures at the beginning of the Second Temple period could have involved a fresh prophetic revelation. Yaqubi is careful to note that Zerubbabel actually physically retrieves the Torah and the books of the prophets from a fire pit wherein the wicked Buchnatzar had tossed them in a futile attempt to eradicate these sacred scriptures. Zerubbabel's sole authorial activity consists in making new copies of these presumably charred remnants. By the 10th and the 11th centuries, the story about Ezra successfully regenerating the Mosaic Torah that 4 Ezra relates has become a common polemical trope among Samaritan, Karaite, and Muslim critics who argue that the scriptures revered by contemporary Jews are in fact deviant ones, which have little or no relationship with what Moses originally received on Sinai, and that the primary blame for fostering such textual corruption and unsanctioned novelty should be laid on Ezra and his scholastic heirs. It thus seems that we require probably a more nuanced approach to Islamic attitudes toward revelatory writings that were supposedly authored or at least transmitted by early ancestral characters like an Adam or an Abraham. The prophetology of Islam is heavily invested in the faultless transmission of revelatory texts by divinely authorized spokespeople, a perspective whose primary lines can be traced back through Manichaeism and certain Jewish Christian groups into the Second Temple period of Jewish literary production. Now, while these distinct religious communities sometimes differ among themselves regarding the precise identities of those heroes and sages who are worthy of the title prophet or apostle, they are nevertheless united in their insistence that these authentic teachers produced and or transmitted scriptures, many of which continued to circulate or emerge among a variety of biblically affiliated groups during late antiquity and the medieval era. In the Islamic arena, we hear about one or more books revealed to or bequeathed by or attributed to famous figures like Adam, Seth, Enosh, Enoch, who is Idris, Noah, Shem, Abraham, David, Solomon, and Daniel. And as had been emphasized in studies by Uri Rubin and Eitan Kohlberg, the production and the transmission of revelatory writings by biblical ancestors and forefathers was an especially popular theme in early Shiite thought, and the affinities of this theme with possibly kindred chains of transmission visible in earlier writings, such as the Cave of Treasures cycle, or the Jewish historian Josephus, or even the Hebrew Book of Jubilees, have been registered. Even the non-Haranian Sabaeans, probably not nativist pagans, but Mandeans, who in this instance are addressing themselves to Muslims, can boast of their fidelity to, quote, the religion of Seth, end quote, and vow, aver, that they still possess his book, that is Seth's Kitab, thanks to the archival efforts of Noah at the time of the flood. A quotation that's provided for you in the handout is 2C. And one of the unusual features of the Muslim rosters, which are visible in such varied locales as Tafsir or Tariq, and the stories of the prophets, is their assignment of exact numerical totals to each prophet or transmitter. As we have seen, 1 or 2 or 10 or 21 for Adam, 29 or 50 for Seth, 30 for Enoch, Idris, and so on. While the actual individual identities of these separate works remain largely opaque, the numbers are surely suggestive of Islam's acquaintance with, if not its tolerance of, a massive library of biblically affiliated scriptural sources. Occasionally, such sources can be readily identified, even though the precise means whereby a particular text entered this new linguistic tradition cannot be reconstructed with certainty. Near the close of his summary of the life and the rule of David, the Israelite king, the late 9th century historian Yaqubi exemplifies the Israelite king's poetic gifts by supplying Arabic language translations in this order of Psalms 18, 1, 148, 149, 150, and finally, with the incipit, quote, then David said in the last psalm, end quote, an Arabic version of apocryphal Psalm 151. The comparison of Yaqubi's text of Psalm 151, the apocryphal one, with the Greek and the Syriac renderings that are found in some Christian canons reveals some unsurprising affinities. But there's also one motif which Yaqubi's version of his psalm shares with only one chronological predecessor, namely the Hebrew version of Psalm 151 that was discovered in the lengthy Qumran Psalm scroll, one of the Dead Sea Scrolls from Cave 11. That peculiar, singular linkage between a long-lost Hebrew psalm and then the version that Yaqubi shows up with almost a millennium later complicates any linear explanation which posits only Christian writings or informants as sources for his own book of Psalms. But usually the task is much more difficult. There are, for example, multiple places in Muslim literature where citations from or excerpts of allegedly Enochic literature occur. these are going to normally appear under the label of the Quranic name Idris, an enigmatic appellation whose ultimate identity with the seventh pre-flood biblical forefather is nevertheless widely accepted by both traditional and critical scholars. We hear of books of Idris that were discovered among the holdings of a library in Iraq, or of a so-called Sunan Idris, supposedly a collection of Enochic tracts that had been translated from Syriac into Arabic by a certain Isa and then deposited in a mosque in Kufa. The occasional quotations provided in later Muslim literature from these and similar works, unfortunately, don't correlate very well with what we know about older Enochic collections that we have in, for example, in the Ethiopic Book of Enoch or the Slavonic Book of Enoch, sometimes called First Enoch, Second Enoch. It's nevertheless clear, though, that extra biblical traditions about Enoch or certain popular traditions that were tied to his name, like those that feature rebel angels and their interactions, circulated widely within Muslim circles and even continue to develop in new directions beyond their Jewish and Christian substrates. For example, the notion that Enoch was the first person on earth to cultivate scribal arts is a cultural datum that can be traced all the way back to Jubilees, or even authentic Second Temple Enochic works like the Enochic Book of Watchers. But the recurring correlative idea that Enoch was also the first seamster and inventor of sewn clothing emerges initially from within Arabic language tallies of Enoch's notable civilizing attainments. For there is where one finds the requisite phonemic and morphological ambiguity, which is presumably ultimately responsible for generating this particular achievement between verbs for write and sow. Returning, however, to the Quran, it's remarkable how little lexical evidence is provided in Quran of an indisputable dependence upon Enochic literature like that contained in the Ethiopic or Slavonic books of Enoch, or even in the pseudo-Enochic Jewish work that's called Third Enoch. Almost all of the examples which scholars have proposed to date can just as easily be explained without invoking any kind of direct reliance upon any of these apocryphal Enochic books. The same can also be said for other parascriptural works like the Book of Jubilees or the Apocalypse of Abraham. Stephen Wasserstrom has demonstrated the likely impact of traditions found in the Apocalypse of Abraham upon the later stories we have about a Jewish prince named Bulukiah, one of the tales that figures in some collections of the 1001 Nights. Serious attempts to uncover knowledge of this same apocalypse within certain Quranic surahs falter, however, in light of the extant manuscript evidence for the Slavonic Apocalypse of Abraham, all of which postdates Quran by at least 2 centuries or more. The passage in Surah 6, verses 74 through 79, where Abraham rebukes the idolatry practiced by his father and is led to embrace the true God only after realizing that heavenly bodies, such as the stars, the moon, and the sun, are inferior to their creator, certainly looks like it could be an evocation of chapter 7 of the Apocalypse of Abraham, where a similar story is told. Yet one must tread carefully. Those scholars who have worked most closely with the Slavonic manuscripts of the Apocalypse consider its 7th chapter to be a very late redactional insertion. The dubious religious allegiances of Abraham's immediate family we already have embedded for us in Bible and in authentic Second Temple parascriptural sources like Jubilees. And there's a pre-Islamic Palestinian midrash that famously constructs a confrontation between Abraham and the Babylonian king Nimrod over the question of which natural force or meteorological element is deserving of human worship. Moreover, the closest analogs to the latter part of this Quranic episode, wherein Abraham contemplates recognizing the divinity of one or more of the celestial bodies, actually appear in Hebrew language medieval stories about Abraham's forced isolation in a cave, all of which seem to have been translated from earlier Arabic language exemplars. The cumulative weight of the evidence currently at our disposal for analyzing that particular Quranic episode would seem to point toward the irrelevance of the apocalypse of Abraham for reconstructing its possible background. But there remain, nevertheless, some intriguing echoes of apocryphal lore in Muslim literature which merit closer study. Tabari's knowledge of the names of the wives of the antediluvian forefathers, the wives of ancestors like a Seth or an Enosh or Mahalalel or a Lamech, not to mention the authentically Second Temple name Imzara for the wife of Noah, is clearly indebted to sources like Jubilees, which provide those names, which you don't find in Bible. The cryptic notice about the 100-year sleeper in the second surah, verse 259, is certainly based in part upon destruction of Jerusalem legends, like those that feature Jeremiah or Abimelech, as found in the apocryphal book of the Paralipomena of Jeremiah. The angelic pair that are imprisoned in Babylon, Harut and Marut, are transparent avatars of the erstwhile righteous divine judges that God once sent to teach pre-flood humanity proper forms of behavior, as described in Jubilees chapter 4 and chapter 5. And these are part of the parascriptural resonances of this widely dispersed post-Quranic tale of Harut wa Marut. The scalding waters of the Quranic flood may be indebted to the flood that's depicted in the Enochic animal apocalypse, similarly described as boiling waters. The Quranic Maqam Ibrahim is possibly a reflex of the tower, the castle, or the house of Abraham, mentioned multiple times in Jubilees. When we combine these and other potential overlaps with those indisputable instances where Qur'an and its derivative literatures draw upon rich reservoirs of biblically allied traditions found amongst Jews, Christians, and other biblically based communities, like the apocryphal Gospels or the Christianized Alexander Romance and so on, it should finally emerge as no surprise that Islamic literature, and most especially its post-Quranic expressions, as based on Quranic material, offers a very fertile and still largely unexploited site for the student of the lore that connects Bible and Quran. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Reeves, for this wonderful and amazing talk about what kind of Bible or what type of Bible does the Quran presume to be familiar with. So if you may allow me, Professor Reeves, since many of the students are like beginners, they don't know so much of that material. So if you may allow me, I would like to try to put maybe in a couple of minutes what you said in about 75 to try to summarize for them or to clarify for them some of the major things that you discussed. So basically, you say, well, in the Near East in late antiquity, there was no such a thing as the Bible. So, so you're saying that, you know, the Quran is referring, for example, to the people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab, for example, or الَّذِينَ يَقْرَؤُونَ الْكِتَابَ مِنْ قَبْلِكَ, so those who read al-Kitab before you. But what is this al-Kitab? What is this book that the Quran is referring to? Since in reality, as you said, that during late antiquity, there were not a single Bible, but there were many different Bibles according to the many different communities, like as you said, for example, the Ethiopian church, which of course has a Bible that is much more broader than many of the other churches that existed at the time. So the Bible in many of the churches had different apocrypha, different pseudepigrapha that were included as part of what they considered or what they may have called as the Bible.
That's right.
So absolutely. I mean, so what Bible or what is Al-Kitab that the Quran is referencing to? I think that's a very important question that you have raised. And you asked, of course, I mean, since different communities had different apocryphal works, different traditions, you referenced, for example, the Cave of Treasures and went through it and said, for example, you know, like you said in the Quran, it doesn't just even refer to Al-Kitab. You said there are other phrases that the Quran also uses, such as, for example, Suhufi Ibrahim wa Musa, the scriptures of Abraham and Moses. And what are those suhuf, right? What are those scriptures that the Quran is here referencing? And you basically touched upon, you know, some of the apocryphal works that existed at the time and some of the pseudepigrapha, like the Testament of Abraham, the Apocalypse of Abraham, along with other, you know, Abrahamic or patriarchal testaments that existed during late antiquity, and whether the Quran is either familiar or not familiar, or that there were other traditions, because even if some of the texts could be perhaps not, they don't predate the 7th century, as you have said, but there could have been, you know, some themes that you suggested, or layers, editorial layers that predate the 7th century. And you said, you know, that they could have been based on some of earlier traditions that may have started from perhaps homilies or even school exercises, as you said. And you said, you know, that there are even other phrases, like the Quran uses as-suhuf al-ula, you know, the primal scriptures, or asatir al-awwaleen. And by the way, even asatir al-awwaleen, the Quran contextualizes it not even to a Jewish or a Christian audience, but it is the non-believers, it's the mushrikun who speak about asatir al-awwaleen, the stories of the ancient, you know, the books of the ancient. And what were they? What could they have been? So those were, of course, very, very important things. And obviously, you later touched upon, you know, some examples of several individuals in Muslim traditions, such as Wahb ibn al-Munabbih and Ka'b al-Ahbar, who used what is known in the Muslim tradition as Isra'iliyat, which are, of course, Jewish and Christian traditions. And they're not necessarily, as you showed, they're not necessarily biblical traditions. Actually, the vast majority of the Isra'iliyat doesn't really come from the Bible. It comes from many of the other books, the apocryphal books, the pseudepigrapha, and so forth. And as you said, for example, you gave an example that the Azra traditions apparently were widespread knowledge at the time when many of those Muslim traditions collected many of these stories concerning the Isra'iliyat. And so I guess it's very interesting and intriguing, and I do appreciate the amazing and great talk that you gave, and hope that the students here have got, you know, a good grasp of that. And before I open the floor to questions, if I ask the first question, if I take that privilege, I was wondering throughout the time you were talking about, you know, what the Quran perhaps was referring to. Did you consider perhaps Daniel Madigan's thesis concerning the term Al-Kitab? Because the Quran also refers to itself as Al-Kitab, but obviously during the time of the Quran, it was not a book. And so Daniel Madigan, of course, you know, suggested that when the Quran refers to itself as Al-Kitab, it is not really talking of itself as a book per se, but it is talking, you know, about, you know, this cosmological commandment of God. So I was wondering, do you perhaps think that maybe the Quran, when it talks about Ahl al-Kitab, or the Kitab of the people of the past, is it perhaps something that not necessarily a book, but something beyond that?
I think that's a very good point that you're bringing up, and I would endorse what you're saying and what Professor Madigan has said, and the beyond part brings it into, I think, in terms of how most of this material was being transmitted during the 7th century is not necessarily in written form. Well, I mean, it's not to say there aren't any written texts, but that the audience for such a written text would be very limited. Whereas in the oral register and the homiletic sphere, this is the way that people are learning their scripture, so to speak, through the sermons and through the presentations and through storytellers. And you move it, let's say, I'm thinking of the example in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. Most of the people don't learn Bible by reading Bible. They learn Bible by looking at, say, stained glass windows, scenes of biblical scenes that are depicted in stained glass windows of churches, or from the kinds of sermons that they're hearing from the priests. And this is going to necessarily include within it a much broader spectrum of traditional lore than you have confined within the written text. And so I'm very sensitive to this oral reservoir of stuff. I'm just not sure how I can go about proving it, getting to it, since it leaves so little trace as opposed to a written text. There, you've got the text; it's there, right? But things that people say they're gone as soon as you say them, and they remain in the head and then are transmitted by tradients later on orally. I think that's the primary way that most of this material is being taught and being learned, and it's going to be that way for a couple of centuries, probably, right? Certainly, literacy in the Islamic world is light years ahead of the way it's going to be working in Western Europe. But again, you've got a primarily oral culture that all of this stuff is coming out of.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Reeves, for that. We can start with the questions from the students, and I see that the first couple of questions are in Farsi, and unfortunately...
Abdullah, sorry. So I have translated all the Farsi questions, and I have sent them to you in direct message. I have also copied all the English questions. So if you check my direct messages to you, you will see a list of questions.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Okay, so... all right, so the first question, it says, thank you for your presentation. What is your opinion about the statement that the scrolls of Abraham mentioned in the Quran refer to parts of the book of Genesis that talk about Abraham's life and issue commands to him?
So we're not talking about actual scrolls attributed to Abraham, but scrolls that simply describe, let's say, a vita or a life for Abraham. I'm trying to understand the question, because the way that I understand scrolls of Abraham in the Quranic reference is that they're attributing them to Abrahamic authorship, and not necessarily talking about Abraham as a subject of a biography or providing stories about Abraham.
Okay, that's clear, I guess, from your answer. So you feel basically that the scrolls of Abraham presumes that it was authored by Abraham, or at least, a tradition in which Abraham is presumed to be the one who received this kind of
yes, that's possible too, since we have traditions about Abraham inheriting a legacy from his ancestors. The way the Book of Jubilees describes it is that he's the first one who learns Hebrew since the time of creation, which it assumes that Hebrew is the language of creation, and so scrolls that say were authored by some of his ancestors, like Adam or Seth, they don't come to light again until Abraham is able to rehabilitate them, so to speak, and bring them back into the public sphere. So yeah, it could be scrolls authored by Abraham as putative author. He's received a revelation, like these testaments of Abraham, or scrolls that were transmitted by Abraham, not necessarily authored by.
All right, thank you for that. The next question is a very difficult one, I guess. It says, in your opinion, what is the ultimate origin of the Quran and how was it compiled?
Whoa. Well, isn't this what
That's
the
a
whole summer
$1,000,000
school
question.
is about? Isn't this what the whole summer school is all about? I think Quran is something that's going to emerge as a kind of a what can we say, a conglomeration of all these different traditions that I've been mentioning over the course of my lecture. And it's fueled by a common interest that is shared with some of these earlier scriptures, and the notion that there's going to be a time of judgment that's coming very soon, that there's kind of an apocalyptic message to it. At least the surahs, the earlier surahs certainly have this kind of atmosphere to them, that you need to act now, and because God has run out of patience. And that particular climate of apocalypticism was very much alive and fervent there at the end of the 6th and the early 7th century, with the clash of the empires that's taking place between Constantinople and the Sasanian Empire, and then eventually the coming of the Muslim armies out of the Arabian Peninsula, all happening there in very short period of time. That's the atmosphere out of which all this is coming. And some, not all, but some of these Jewish writings and some of these Christian writings participate, or they breathe that same kind of fiery atmosphere. This is the attraction, I think.
Right. Well, thank you. Okay, so the next question asks, it says that you mentioned some texts that post-date the Quran. And so do we have any references to the Quran or debates on the Quran or other Islamic traditions in post-Quranic Christian texts?
Post-Quranic Christian texts, I'm sure there are some. I'm much more familiar with the Jewish tradition with regard to this particular question. And there I would say that we certainly have, if I can shift it from the Christian to the Jewish, since I have more information there. A text like the one that I mentioned earlier, the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, grows up in Palestine sometime during the 8th or the 9th century of the Common Era, and shares a lot of interesting features with Quran. And in fact, some of it's essentially a kind of what some scholars call a rewritten version of Bible, starting with creation, bringing it down to, from their point of view, the last historical things in the Bible that you have in the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. But some of its biblical scenes, as they're rewritten, aren't modeled on Bible, but are modeled on Quran. And for example, there's a chapter that describes Adam and his wife's disobedience in the garden, follows essentially the same kind of narrative structure that we see in Surah 2 for Adam's disobedience and the rebellion of Iblis, and not the kind of a narrative structure you have in Genesis chapter 3. And I don't think this is accidental, because this allows the Jewish editor then to bring into the Jewish theological universe a character like Iblis, who wasn't there before. Dubs him Samael, who now becomes the Satan figure, and is going to operate in much that same way that we see Iblis operating in Qur'an and post-Quranic literature. It affords him a space. It affords him the opportunity to introduce that particular spiritual character. Because prior to that, in Jewish literature, you don't have a fall of Satan kind of narrative. It first emerges in Christian literature, and then from there you're going to see it taken into Muslim literature, and then I think from Quran it comes into Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, and that's not the only instance of that kind of dependence. I've been fascinated with the possibility that Turkey Rabi Ellis is much more interested in dialoguing with Islam than they are with, say, Christian others. Maybe because of the rises in the East.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I'll keep thinking about in the Eastern Christian literature in terms of interactions or interfacing between Quran and Christian. See, Cave of Treasures doesn't have that kind of thing, but in some of the later vernacular versions of Cave of Treasures, like eventually is going to appear in Christian Arabic forms and in Ethiopic. I've noticed that in some of those Christian Arabic translations, they will use Quranic locutions for certain scenes. So you'll see, like, for example, the notion that Iblis whispers to the primal couple in the garden, the use of that particular verb, which is not in the biblical scene, but will appear in some of these Christian Arabic translations for that, if they're clearly getting, see, that language from Quran.
Yes, you're right. And even Saadia Gaon's translation of the Hebrew Bible itself shows some, of course, vocabulary that appears to stem directly from the Quran.
Yes, you're right.
Well, thank you for that so much, Professor Reeves. The next question concerns about the Apocrypha concerning the Adamic, Apocrypha. The question is asking, what were the language of those books that talks about, Adam and the first creation and so forth?
For these apocryphal Adam books, they start to be produced in Greek, probably during the 2nd or 3rd centuries of the Common Era, and then will be translated from Greek into some of the languages of the Eastern Christian communities, like Armenian or Georgian, Coptic, and Syriac, and then eventually Christian Arabic and Ethiopic. We also get some Latin translations because they go to the West as well. And interestingly, you get translations into some of the languages, Slavic languages, called Old Church Slavonic, which will eventually then get into old forms of Russian and Bulgarian and Ukrainian, going up that way. So they were enormously popular and were continuing to be produced well past the invention of printing. Unfortunately, those are languages that I've not studied and not competent to pronounce upon, but there are friends of mine who work on those particular collections of Adamic writings about the Slavonic tradition, who talk about it's just a rich reservoir of lore, that some of which surely goes back into the period that we're interested in. But things like the life of Adam and Eve, the Latin Vita, it's called the Apocalypse of Moses in its Greek form, even though Moses doesn't appear there anywhere. But it's that and its Latin form were enormously popular and productive of these further Adamic apocryphal writings.
All right, great. Thank you for that. The next question is asking, why is there such an insistence on saying that the Quran was in dialogue with one book? What's wrong with saying that the Quran had knowledge of many books and engaged in dialogue with different ones as needed each time?
Well, I don't want to leave the impression that I'm thinking that Quran was only operating as a conversation partner with one Bible, because remember, at the very beginning, I emphasized there's no such thing as the Bible. We're working with multiple Bibles, and even beyond that, various interpretive penumbra that surrounds all of these Bibles and these parascriptural works that we've been talking about. So I have no issue with you reframing the point as that Quran can operate and interlocute with multiple works as the case may be. So I don't think that there's a real difference here in how we're operating. I wanted to make sure that I want to emphasize that it's not one Bible, but many. But I use in my title the notion of, whose Bible or which Bible. I don't want to leave the impression that that has to be one. But automatically built into it is the notion that we have to expand it beyond one.
Okay, thank you so much.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's clear. I think it's very, very clear. And actually, there was like a follow-up question about the Adamic Apocrypha. She's asking that her question was about the books attributed to Adam and Seth. And yes, I think that's what what you meant by the Adamic Apocrypha. Yes. That's what we actually mean by that they are the books attributed to Adam. Okay.
Yes. In fact, with regard to that question, I could say if the student wants further direction, there is a work by a scholar named Michael Stone. He's the world's expert on the Adam literature, and he's got a book that's called The History of the Literature of Adam and Eve. That's worth looking at for bibliography and further reading.
Okay, thank you so much for pointing that out. Okay, the next question is asking, it seems that the Quran is referring to many versions of Bibles and other biblical traditions which are known and used in different regions of the whole, Near East. Did we have all of those cultural awareness within the Arabian Peninsula? And if not, how would the author of the Quran gain that kind of knowledge?
Well, I think we are going to have a great deal of cultural awareness on the part of the inhabitants of the Arabian Peninsula during that era, because they're simply surrounded by all of these different cultures and societies. Different Jewish communities or Jewish tribes in the case of Medina, different Christian communities depending on the time period that we're talking about or the geographical region that is closest to us. Certainly knowledge of Persian culture and Persian traditions due to the activities of the Sasanian emperors alongst the eastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Awareness of what's happening across the Red Sea with the Aksumite Empire and perhaps traders from Egypt from farther north. There's Coptic Christianity. So I think there's necessarily going to be a lot of interchange and interflow, unless we're talking about somebody who's hermetically sealed up in a cave who doesn't ever interact with anybody else in their society. So they're going to be aware of these different things, and they're going to hear different. I mean, most of these people are going to be multilingual, at least in terms of their oral expression, even if they are not able to read or write a single one of those languages. So I think the possibilities are there for saying Quran is aware of this vast spectrum of stuff.
All right, thank you so much for that. The next question is an easy one, I guess. Is the Gospel of Barnabas post-Quranic?
The one that's printed under that name, yes, it's definitely post-Quran.
All right, thank you for that. Okay, a student is asking about your opinion about the connection between Adam's Suhuf or scriptures and Ginza Rabbah and the possibility of familiarizing the audience of the Quran with it.
Yes, I mentioned in a couple of places in my presentation that we have to take into account that we have other biblically affiliated communities that we often don't consider, like the Mandeans, for whom Ginza Rabbah is their book of Adam. And so here's another possibility that has to be played with. And when you're analyzing cross-culturally, comparatively, the stories that you get about the first couple in Bible, in Quran, in Ginza Rabbah, can you see possible connections back and forth between these? Yes, that definitely has to be brought into the arena for close examination.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you for that.
Of course, how you date the Ginza-Raba now might be another. That's going to create some problems too, because there's all kinds of controversy about the Mandean scriptures, and when were they written down, and because we know there's Mandaic written text pre-Islamic in terms of inscriptions and magical texts, amulets, that kind of thing, coin label. But books like Ginza-Raba or their prayer book or the Book of John, they're associated with the Mandeans, probably were written down later. So we've got to, and they're certainly aware in the apocalypse that you have in the 18th book of the Ginza-Raba. They're certainly aware of Muslim rule. So Muslims are mentioned there.
Oh, I see. So do we know like what the earliest manuscript for the Ginza-Raba is dated as?
That I don't know, but I'm sure it's much later than the time of the Quran. I mean, the actual surviving manuscript. Yes, how much earlier it was being produced in a written form like that? It's hard to come up with any firm, concrete evidence that will help us. But the ideas certainly go back into the pre-Islamic period. The stories and the traditions that surround characters like Adam or his sons. You've got the Seth figure also. You've got the Enosh figure. I mean, it's essentially another way of telling the Adam and Eve story or the garden story. But it's now in a Mandaic key. It's possible, perhaps, that we might have had some Islamic input into that.
Right. Thank you for that. Okay, the next question, I'm having a little difficulty understanding myself, but I'll try to say it as it is, and hopefully maybe you can decrypt it. It says that you probably know some Islamic traditions or hadiths about the biblical books, which you consider very old, belonging to the second half of the 7th century. If it is the case, could you please mention one of them?
Any collections that are talking about biblical books in the second half of the 7th century hadith collections? I'm thinking here of, say, transmitters like Kab al-Akhbar or Wabi bin Munabi. They're clearly familiar with notions of the numbers of the books that comprise a scriptural canon and how many should be assigned to a particular author or a particular tradent and so on and so forth. Are these real, actual, let's say, was there an historical Kab al-Akhbar, or is he a convenient kind of pseudographic label for kind of collecting these sorts of extra biblical traditions? It's hard to come up with a firm answer about that. I would be tempted to say yes, that there are some there, and I'm willing to go and look some more to try to come to a better answer to that particular question. Because it can't be coming out of a vacuum. I mean, those traditions that the Israeliyat traditions that you mentioned, they're just not just suddenly manifesting then. They have a background to them of some kind.
Okay, he clarifies in saying that he's talking about the tradition speaking about the books themselves and not the biblical stories.
Tradition speaking about the books themselves as to their identities? Is that what you mean? Or as to their...
I'm assuming.
The kind of contents that they have? I know In Ibn al-Nadim's Fihris, there's he has a story that he traces back to late Sasanian period or very early Islamic period of people who are collecting scriptures. And I can't remember the name of the tradent that he names there, who talks about how something along the lines when Bible was produced, that it was produced on these particular kinds of materials with gold lettering and these very rich and sumptuous kinds of editions of biblical. I'm trying to remember that, but that might be too late for the question. Or even though Ibn al-Nadim is talking about something that's a couple of hundred years earlier than he. And is presumably relying upon some source that he found in a written collection there as part of his book selling trade. But I can't think of anything else right at the top of right off the top of my head.
All right.
Sorry about that.
Thank you actually for that. And there's a question, a follow-up, I guess, from when we were talking about the origins of the Quran. The question is asking, do you mean that the origin of the Quran is from various books, or that it engages in dialogue with other books?
I mean that it engages in conversation or dialogue with other books, because it is presuming an audience that's familiar with the characters and or literary scenarios in which these characters appear. I mean, it assumes an audience that has, let's say, a fundamental kind of biblical literacy that can operate with this, what I call the scriptural koine. They know who Ibrahim is. They know who Noah is. They don't, because these characters aren't defined for them in Quran. It's assumed that you already know this. Right? The gaps are not filled in. So these have to be then, the audience has to be somebody that has a rudimentary background in these stories, in these traditions, and not let's say, a Zoroastrian background, which doesn't operate with any of these characters at all. And for whom the mention of Ibrahim then would be, well, who's that? Why should I pay attention to that?
Right. Well, thank you for that. I think we're already over our time, so I don't think we will be able to go through all the wonderful and great questions that many of the students have, and we don't want to keep you also more than necessary. So I'd like to thank you so much, Professor Reeves, for the wonderful talk, very insightful. And I personally learned a lot from this talk myself, and I'm sure everyone here has learned about it, whether here in the summer school or even those who are listening to this in the live stream. So thank you so much, Professor Reeves, for your wonderful talk, and we are very grateful that you accepted the invitation.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'm very, very, very happy to participate and to serve. And if you have further questions, don't hesitate to send me a personal email, and I'll try to address whatever concerns you have. It's been a wonderful learning experience on my part too.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Professor Reeves.